Good morning, everyone. You got to love the voice of God at 8 o'clock in the morning. It's just an awesome thing indeed. So welcome. I'm very pleased to see so many of you here, and special welcome to our guest, Dr. Alan Berkowitz. This part of the day and this day together with you is a critically important part of our effort around preventing sexual misconduct. I've made that an important personal mission, and I'm very grateful that Dean John Finnegan has stepped in to lead, because we in fact are dealing with a public health problem. John's been working very hard with his team to develop a comprehensive plan to deliver by the deadline he has, which is October 2nd of this year. But as you well know, there is no silver bullet here. We're building on a good foundation, and we want to and we must do even better. This initiative envisions a university that promotes a culture of health and wellness in relationships, that's committed to due process, and that's safe and free from sexual misconduct of any kind. I selected Dean Finnegan to lead this effort because in the end, culture change will develop from a positive public health framework. I thank him for embracing this initiative and leading with remarkable commitment and intensity. And I know because of his skills and understanding of this issue, this work will eventually result in a healthier and safer university community, and that cannot happen quick enough for my satisfaction. So John, thank you for all you've been doing and will be doing. And with this, let me turn over to Dean Finnegan for his comments, and he will detail for you the work we've done and the work that is yet to do. Good morning, and thank you for being here.
Well, thank you, President Kaler. Eric, thank you very much for this. In getting ready for this and bringing together so many people that are here working on this and this team, I think we can maybe develop a brand new university slogan. And I sat and played with this a little bit last night, and the best I could come up with is, we are driven to thrive. We are driven to thrive. And part of the reason for that is that we didn't invent racism or sexism, but we brought all those things with us to the university community. But one of our obligations as a learning community is to change that culture. And over time, we can provide the exemplar to the rest of society, certainly the rest of Minnesota, on how to do this and how to do it well. And as Eric said, this is not something that we do overnight. This is something that will take a generation, something that will take concerted effort. That said, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step. So the issue for us is moving farther upstream, and that's what a public health approach is all about. Public health approach is multi-layered. We're talking about using all of the strategies of education and communication, systems, policy, culture change, to be able to make this work. And what makes this different from any other effort that we have going on here? So many people in this room have been involved in efforts, for example, to help heal survivors, and so forth. What makes this different is that we're going to try to connect dots, coordinate, and all of you are helping us to move upstream, where we can look at the issues of prevention and the issues of the promotion of health and wellness. As I say, this is a journey. It is not a destination. And ultimately, we want to weave this into the tapestry of the university and assure that it reflects our vision and our values going forward. So I want to give you a few housekeeping tips, I think might be the best way to describe it today. So after you hear from Alan Berkowitz, and it's my pleasure to be one of the hosts of his visit for these 2 days, he and I are going to go over your questions. Many of you submitted questions in advance, but you should have received material for writing a question, and we will make sure those get collected. And after the presentation, I will join Alan in the center stage there, and we will start going over those questions. If you want an index card and you didn't get one, just raise your hand, and we have folks that will make sure that you do. We want to make as much time as we can for as many of your questions as possible, and I do want to let you know that we are recording this, and it is going to be up on the YouTube site. So that means you all have to behave yourselves here, I think, pretty much. Okay. It is now my pleasure to introduce Katie Eichel. And Katie, as you know, is the director of the university's Aurora Center for Advocacy and Education, and she is going to introduce our visitor and our speaker for the day. You may not know that the Aurora Center is one of the nation's longest standing centers in the battle against sexual violence. And Director Eichel and over 90 dedicated volunteers have been in the trenches. They've been leading the fight. They've been supporting survivors on our campus long before this initiative was envisioned. Ladies and gentlemen, please give us a warm early morning welcome to Aurora Center Director Katie Eichel.
Thank you, Dean Finnegan, and good morning and welcome. Now, before we begin, I'd like you to do a favor for me. If you could take a brief moment and turn to someone new around you and greet and introduce yourself. It's really important that we make connections this morning. Go ahead. Excellent. Thank you. You know, something important that I've come to know about doing the work to end gender-based violence is that it's really important to collaborate and make these connections. And so I have the honor and pleasure of introducing Dr. Alan Berkowitz this morning. In any field of study, there are notable researchers who are well published and cited. And in the field of sexual assault prevention and health promotion, Dr. Berkowitz is an academic luminary. He has over 25 years of experience in higher education as a trainer, psychologist, faculty member, and counseling center director. He helps colleges, universities, public health agencies, military organizations, and communities design programs that address health and social justice issues, and is well known for scholarship and innovative programs which address issues of substance abuse, sexual assault, gender, and diversity. As the editor and founder of the Report on Social Norms, he's been a lead researcher and central figure in the development of social norms theory. At Hobart and William Smith College, he developed one of the first rape prevention programs for men in the United States and co-directed its Men and Masculinity program. Now, Dr. Berkowitz is not only known for his academic contributions, but I've come to know him as a kind, humble, and curious individual. He may not remember this, but I actually first met Dr. Berkowitz several years ago at a conference in Boston. And I happened to be sitting at a table eating breakfast when he approached and introduced himself and asked to join me and my table and my colleague. And as we got talking, he asked questions about what it is that we did, who we were, and how our experience was going. And what I found was a true genuineness and depth to him. And lo and behold, later on, what he didn't realize is I had read almost every single one of his articles, and then there he was up at the front of the stage as the keynote speaker. And I found remembering how refreshing it was that here was an academic that you could also have a true connection with. And so as we make connections with each other in this room to create a healthier University of Minnesota, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Alan Berkowitz.
Good morning. Regarding the introduction, I just think it's sad that we would say that you could find an academic who you could also make a true connection with. So that's a different culture change issue, right, that we're not talking about today. So what we're here to talk about is not good news. That's clear to everyone. But what I do want to say is this institution's response to this issue, and your president and his leadership team and all of you, is good news. And that really, in my career, I have never seen an institution respond in this way from the top down with such administrative engagement. And because we are talking about a cultural problem that runs very deep, that in some way is part of all of us, almost all of us are not offenders, but from a different point of view, all of us are part of the culture that allows offenders to offend. And I hope I'll make that clear. So really, we can only solve this if we all take responsibility for it. And we can only solve this if the leaders take responsibility for it. So you're all on the beginning first steps of a long journey that will not produce quick results. And in a culture that wants quick results, you're resisting another culture, right, that wants to show results quickly. So I really want to appreciate the way you're going about this here. And I believe that in the long run that will make a difference, but that it will require patience on all of your parts, because long-term change doesn't happen in a short time, right? And in Katie's introduction, she used the term gender-based violence. So I think as we get into this presentation, you'll hopefully understand why we're using that term to describe this phenomenon. So I put charting the way ahead, right? Because what we want to do is create a climate to inhibit. So what we know is that most individuals who perpetrate are men, but most men don't perpetrate. And most individuals who perpetrate sexual harassment and sexual assault started their career before they got here. So you don't create the problem, but the environment either inhibits the problem or it permits the problem. So any problem, if I want to do petty theft, right, if I want to steal something, if I want to look for an open car in the garage and steal your CD player, I came here with that mentality. But what we do here makes it easier or harder for me to do that. So that's why it's all of our responsibility. And let's take the CD player example a little further, just to use a metaphor. So if one of you doesn't unlock your car, and I steal something from your car, you didn't do anything illegal, and you didn't do anything immoral, and you should have, we could say, especially in Minnesota, right? You should be able to not lock your car. Now, if you did lock your car, I would just take it from someone else's car. So if we taught you to lock your car, that might be a good strategy to protect you. But that doesn't prevent me from doing it somewhere else. And if everyone locked their car on this campus, I would go somewhere else. Now, what about the person in the garage who sees me cruising around looking for an unlocked car, right? So we have all these elements. We have the possibility that individuals can reduce their own risk of something happening, but that's not prevention. Because if we all did that here, the perpetrators would go somewhere else. We have the bystanders who could intervene to stop the problem, and we have the person who's causing the problem. So as we look at this or any other issue, we need to look at all those three elements, and we look at the role of the bystander, it really becomes a community issue. And actually, Dean Finnegan and I were looking at the news this morning about a sexual harassment controversy at another institution. And it was clear that there was a whole long history of bystanders observing unacceptable behavior, and that information was never used by that institution. And now that institution is in the news and getting all this bad media, and also many people have been harmed by this person's behavior. So every time one of us sees something that makes us uncomfortable, which is unfortunately not unusual, we have to ask ourselves, what is my responsibility in this situation? So that's one of the things we're going to talk about today, is the role of the bystander in preventing sexual harassment and sexual assault, which is all of us, as well as to understand the mentality of the perpetrator, to understand some of the myths about victim and what leads to what we call victim blaming, talk about false accusations, because while there are legitimate false accusations that, let's say, an accusation can be proven to be false, they are very, very, very rare. And you'll see in the national discussion now that's happening, the issue of false accusations is getting a lot of attention, but it's, let's say, not consistent with the scholarship, which is the research is clear that even if false accusations happen, they're very rare. But that leads us to another problem, which is we have to have due process in every one of these incidents, because both parties deserve, let's say, a fair process. So this is really complicated, but I think we know enough to do some good work here. And as I said, I'm very impressed with the way you're starting out. So I want to talk about some of the goals, what we know about effective prevention. People like me use the term the science of prevention. So there is a science that shows what works. I want to talk about what we're talking about, social norms, which is basically what people think other people think about something. And it turns out that as human beings, even if I completely misread all of you and I erroneously assume certain things about you, based on that assumption, I would act certain ways. So when we make erroneous assumptions about other human beings who we live with, we act in certain ways that, let's say, are inaccurate because they're not based on accurate information. So the social norms approach is a way of showing people what other people really think and believe about different issues. So let's say we can take that in consideration. It's not about conformity. It's not about, I know that all of you want me to be X, maybe I don't want to be X. But if I don't want to be X, it's still good to know whether or not you want me to be X. So it's important information about our social environment. And I want to talk about bystander intervention and give you some quick case studies and make some recommendations. And it's a lot in a short amount of time, so I'll be going fast. But it's kind of like getting us started. It's a good way to get us all oriented in the same way. So anything we do should be based on theory and research, right? That there's knowledge and we need to draw on that knowledge. That we must understand the problem correctly, which, as I'm saying in the case of gender-based violence, it's a cultural problem. It's not just a Minnesota problem or in one place. It's a really pervasive societal problem. That we need to understand what are the barriers here and in general so that we can overcome those barriers. We need to create the infrastructure, which is why it's going to take a long time. We can't just solve this problem tomorrow. You know, if you have like a hotline, like the military has a sexual assault hotline where any service member can call in to an 800 number. And when they first created that hotline, it wasn't working. So some leader got upset, and that leader delegated another person to solve the problem, and that problem was solved within a week because it was a technical problem, right? You call the hotline, you see what happens, you see how the call is being responded to or not responded to, and if it isn't working, you make a fix. So we have this fix-it mentality, but for problems like this, there isn't a simple fix like that. Prevention is a community-wide process, and the efforts must be adapted and modified over time. So that's what I'm glad to see you folks are starting that. And it's all of our responsibility. So here's a paradox, and I would say it takes a certain emotional maturity to live with this paradox. So someone you know accuses someone else. In the case of sexual assault, we should always believe the accusation, because 95% of the time it's true. But we also have to treat the accused person as innocent until proven guilty. And we know both of those can't be true. one person is guilty and one person isn't, or one person is accusing someone accurately and one person did something. And it's very easy to prejudge the situation and jump to conclusions and assume that the accusation isn't true or whatever. So we have to teach this community, don't be shy, everyone, even though you'll be Minnesota nice, everyone can come in and sit down. We need to teach this community to live with this contradiction, which is when someone is accused, we believe the accuser and we treat the accused as innocent. And from a criminal justice point of view, the best way to prove a false accusation is to treat the accuser as if they were telling the truth. So even from an investigative detective point of view, it's a better strategy. Right, we know this with dealing with terrorism and other things, that waterboarding and all these harsh treatments don't produce good evidence. The best way to get good evidence is to treat the person like a human being, which is what they are, even if they're doing inhuman things. So we're not going to go through this, but this is actually what the CDC uses for public health problems. We have all these nested levels in a society of how do we approach your entering students? What programming do we give them? What programming do we give groups that exist on campus, or departments, or programs? Maybe we have something different for your health sciences, someone who's training to be a nurse or a doctor, than we have for an undergraduate who's trained to be a social worker. What do we do on the campus level, and what do we do as a society? And the issue here is that whatever we do in all these different circles has to be consistent, has to be mutually reinforcing. So what you have on a college campus or university campus, especially a big one like this, right? This place is big, is you have a lot of people doing a lot of things and they don't mesh. They don't fit together. People are doing really well-intentioned good things and using resources, but they're using resources in a way that what I say is not synergistic and mutually reinforcing. So it doesn't mean that everyone has to do the same thing, because you have a very diverse community. You have a lot of heterogeneity here, not only in terms of, let's say, academic efforts, but in terms of who your students and your staff are. So we're not saying it's a one-size-fits-all, but we have to have some principles and some goals and some agreements about what we're all trying to do and how we're trying to do it, so that in each separate domain, we're doing things that are mutually reinforcing. And that's how you bring about culture change. So we have to talk about what we do, how we do it, and how we put that all together into a long-term comprehensive planned effort that makes a difference. So let's take one example. Inviting speakers, right? We have tons of speakers being invited to campuses like this all the time. So your Greek community is required to have education on this topic. Your athletic community is required to have education on this topic. We have people teaching courses about this topic. Your student leaders are required to have education on this topic. But very often who we bring in to speak about this issue isn't coordinated. So very often I'll go to a campus and the person that has Katie's job says, "Oh, I didn't know you were coming," because I was invited by another department. That's a lack of coordinated effort. If she knew that I was coming, hopefully she would have things she wanted me to do in addition to whatever else someone had invited me for. So that's just an example. We really need to avoid the kind of fragmentation that is very common on a campus this large. So we have policies and procedures. We have to have good policies and good procedures for implementing them. And because we know that most offenders are repeat offenders, one of the best forms of prevention is to bust someone. You know, and if you just look now, the good news is that this problem is coming out in the open. The bad news is that it's like so creepy. So now we have Bill Cosby and Roger Ailes and Penn State. We have all these very public examples of serial predators who do this as a lifestyle. So if one of those individuals was busted early on, we would have prevented a lot of assaults. So a policy approach is not separate from a prevention approach. We have services for victims. So this is one of the crimes where we have the least people reporting that they were they're a victim, or even believing that they were a victim. So if we want to solve this problem here, we have to make it safe for everyone who experiences sexual harassment and sexual assault to feel that they can go somewhere and tell someone. And if we don't do that, we won't solve the problem because we won't have the reports of the incidents that we can do something about. So I'm not here to talk about those two things, but we want to see that's part of the bigger picture. What I'm here to talk about is what we call prevention, and the reason I say it's primarily for men and teaching someone to avoid risk or reduce risk is primarily for women and other at-risk groups, is that almost all sexual assaults and sexual harassment is committed by male-identified individuals. Even there's research shows that women in same-sex relationships who are surveyed about being sexually assaulted, most of their sexual assaults are from men. So even if we want to acknowledge gender fluidity and create a welcoming community for people of different sexual orientations, we still need to also acknowledge that this problem is primarily, not exclusively, but primarily caused by people who identify with male and who try and outdo other men at being male. So that's why we say prevention is men's responsibility. Because the other thing is that the men who do this care most about what other men think of them. They're trying to score points with other men. They're trying to get credibility. So we generally frame prevention as a men's issue, and we talk about risk reduction, which is, putting a ticket on your bicycle when you didn't lock it. Public safety says you didn't lock your bicycle and someone. If everybody reduces their risk, that's not prevention. We call that rape avoidance or risk reduction. Now, there are very good empirically validated risk reduction programs that show that if you teach women and other vulnerable groups how to reduce their risk, that those groups experience less assaults. So you should consider that as part of what you're going to be doing here. But you don't consider that to be prevention. Because as I said, if everyone at University of Minnesota gets that training, then I'll just go across the street and do it somewhere else. And unfortunately, that's what happens when you kick students out, right? When you kick students out for these offenses, they go somewhere else and they offend. The private school world is having big bad news about this issue now, because if you read the newspapers, a lot of teachers at boarding schools have offended and been fired, and then they just went to other boarding schools and they just go from one to the other. So that's the pattern. But as I said, even if we didn't create those behaviors, we create the environment that allows them to happen. That's why it's all of our job. So I don't expect you to read this, but this is from SUNY Albany, which is a similarly large institution, and they also were using a public health approach to address this problem. And one of my colleagues wrote me and said, for the first time in 8 years, we're showing significant decreases in a variety of risk behaviors, and we don't really know why this is happening, but we know that for all these years we've been doing, let's say, the right thing, the thing based on science, and after 8 years, all of a sudden, everything started going down at once. And I want to show you that slide because it's to reinforce this idea that this is really a long-term effort, and that we're not going to see quick results, although we can and should measure things that will tell us we're heading in the right direction, such as maybe more victims feeling safe to come forward and report, or more bystanders intervening. So, do we focus on potential victims? Yes, we can, and as I said, that's called risk reduction. Do we focus on the minority of assault? That's harder because it's not really an easily changeable behavior, but you can make the environment more difficult. And that's where we really want to focus on the majority who are bystanders. So, when you think of the times when somebody did something that made you uncomfortable and you didn't do something, then what we call you a bystander. And of course, it's not a simple dilemma. There are very good reasons why you didn't do something, why we all didn't do something, including me. But when we understand those reasons and we understand what we could have done that, let's say, would have been okay, then we can all do more. And when we get bystanders to be what we call active bystanders and intervene, then we create the environment that inhibits the perpetrators. So that's what we want to do as a community. And as I said, the research is that 5% of men commit approximately 95% of assaults, but that 20 to 40% of men do other behaviors that we would consider coercive, but that would not be legally a crime. And a lot of times when we talk to men, men feel defensive about this issue, so we have to diffuse that and say, most of you are not going to do anything wrong, but most of you can help us prevent the few who are. And we know that the biggest predictor of being assaulted is being previously assaulted or being in a group that's vulnerable. For instance, trans individuals have shockingly high rates of assault. And if you look at it this way, if I want to take advantage of someone, which means doing something that they don't agree to, which is what sexual harassment and sexual assault are, then it's easier for me to do it if someone's more vulnerable. Right? So if I go to a bar tonight and I find an undocumented immigrant, that person is less likely to report me. If I find a person in a marginal group of some kind, so any group that's marginal in this society, which is people of color, which is poor people, which is immigrants, which is sexual minorities, the rates are much higher. So it's also really a social justice issue. The highest rates of sexual assault are among our native populations, indigenous, the tribal population. So that's a whole discussion. Why is that so high among that group? What is the mindset of this country towards the people who are here first that allows their rates to be so high? And environments either inhibit or encourage behavior. So we want to teach people to reduce their risks, but the danger is if you go to a workshop that says you shouldn't, if you do X, Y, or Z, it will reduce your risk, and then you're assaulted, and then you feel, well, it was my fault because I didn't do what they taught me, that would be bad training. That would be bad education. Reducing your risk, just like when you want to reduce your points on your driver's license so you can get lower insurance, which I have had to do, right? They teach you, I travel a lot, right? They teach you to reduce your risk. So it doesn't mean I won't get a ticket, it means I'm less likely to get a ticket. And in the case of sexual assault risk reduction, we need to teach people to reduce their risk without blaming themselves or other people blaming them if something still happens. That's where the driving metaphor doesn't work anymore, because if I was still speeding, I was speeding. But if someone stole my CD, I didn't do anything wrong, but I could have locked the door. Reduce self-blame and teach self-defense. Self-defense is empirically shown to be an important part of any effective risk reduction program. Now, if we want to inhibit perpetrators, we have to understand the mindset, right? We have to understand their methodology, and we need to create an environment that inhibits them. And then, of course, we need to encourage bystanders to intervene, which means we need to reduce the barriers to intervention, and we need to teach people how to intervene. Because maybe you don't want to intervene because you're afraid of physical harm, or maybe there's a power differential between you and that person and you don't want to suffer negative consequences, or there's all kinds of reasons why we might not intervene, but there might be ways we could intervene that wouldn't incur those consequences, so that's what we need to learn. And we need to strengthen the norms that inhibit violence. And what we've learned in public health is that we're not ignoring the negative, because we wouldn't be here if there wasn't a negative. But if we focus on the positive, we grow the positive. We increase the positive. So we focus on the positive. So we teach people to respond to risk. We teach people consent. You and many institutions now have an affirmative consent policy, which is really the ideal, because the idea is before I do anything, I need to know that you're okay with it. It's easier said than done. The other thing about consent is because most people have consent, it's not enough to teach people how to have consent. You need to teach people to notice when other people don't have consent so they can intervene as bystanders. You need to understand gender because, as I said, it's not for no reason that most assaults are committed by male-identified individuals. There's a reason for that. How we define masculinity relates to the fact that we have sexual assault, even though most men don't sexually assault. Engage the bystander. So we're going to see that people think things about other people that result in them being bystanders. So I was part of a study where we asked college men, would you respect someone who intervened to prevent a sexual assault? And most men said yes. And then we asked, do you think most men on this campus would respect someone who intervened to prevent a sexual assault? And most men said no. So you see that most men would respect someone, but don't know that most men would respect someone. So if I think that I'm going to lose social credibility with my friends by intervening, then I'm less likely to intervene. And if I know that my friends would respect me if I intervene, I'm more likely to intervene. So which of these will help us to support victim recovery, engage bystanders, and inhibit perpetrators? And I would say all of the above, but specifically emphasizing the bystander. So as I said, we want to do everything together so that they're pushing us. Like, we're in Minnesota, right? So we can use the example, when your car's stuck in the snow, right? And you get a bunch of people, and what do? You go 1, 2, 3, and you all have to push at the same time. Because if you don't push at the same time, the car won't get out of the ditch. So you have to have a coordinated effort that's, let's say, synchronized. Avoid scattershot programming. The community must understand the issue of false accusations. As I said, even though every accused person deserves to be treated innocent until proven guilty, the chances are very, very high that the accusation is true. And of course, what the media does is focus on the few cases of legitimate false accusations. We need to deal with victim trauma and victim blaming, because even if I could have prevented someone from stealing my stereo, I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't do anything illegal. I didn't do anything immoral. I took a risk. Maybe I always lock my car when I park in the garage here because it's an anonymous place. But maybe if Dean Finnegan invites me for dinner and I park my car in his driveway, I think that I'm safe in his driveway, so I don't have to lock my car. And then someone takes my stereo. So that doesn't mean that I shouldn't have been able to leave my car unlocked, but it means I could have locked my car and avoided something. So we don't blame me for that event. And sexual assault is the one crime where we tend to always blame the victim, if you think about it. We always say, why did this person do this? Why did this person do this? Why did this person do this? There was a court case in Colorado, this is a true story, where a young woman in her 20s went out either in Denver or Colorado Springs, but in a city at 2 a.m. to get a pizza, and she was assaulted, and there was no dispute about the facts. It was a cut and dried legal case. The data was there. It was a rape, and the jury acquitted the offender because they said, well, what did she think would happen when she went out at 2 a.m. to get a pizza? So that's called victim blaming. Perpetrator methodology and characteristics, including warning signs, we need to know what to look for. So one big issue that's coming to light now is sexual harassment of graduate students, right? So we need to know what are the warning signs. And that prevention is everyone's responsibility, that most people want to do the right thing. So each of these bullets is a whole educational effort for this community, because each time you have an assault, you will have people blaming the victim, especially when the assailant is a very respectable person with status, such as, you know, the people that get in the news recently. So I would just ask you to think, do you know someone who's had an unwanted experience and you believe this person? And most people, a majority of people say yes to the first question, and almost all those people say yes to the second question. So if we personally believe the accusers that we know, why do we not believe someone that we don't know? And you'll see why when we look at it, because the facts of the case conspire to make the perpetrator's story seem believable and the victim's story seem less believable. There's like a conspiracy of evidence that makes it look a certain way. So most victims are telling the truth. So almost all sexual assaults are committed by men who identify as heterosexual, and we actually call those men hypermasculine. So if we ask the men in the room to take a survey and say, how are you taught to be, quote, a man? And we have certain characteristics like you have to be assertive, you have to be a winner, you have to be emotionally tough, you have to have sex with a lot of women, whatever those characteristics are, most men are actually not comfortable with all of those. We don't feel completely okay about the way we've been taught to be male because it somehow impinges on our humanity. But the men who believe in that script, who believe in that job description, and take it to an extreme, we call them hypermasculine, and they're the ones who sexually assault. So there's a very strong research finding. The biggest predictor of assault is hypermasculine men. So therefore, it's gender-based violence. That's why we call it gender-based violence. So people who are perpetrators look for vulnerable individuals. So let's take a stereotypical situation. Let's say I'm in a bar and people are drinking and I want to, have sex with someone that night. So I go over to a woman and I get in her space. Now, if this was a small workshop, I would ask different women in the room, what do you do when a man gets in your space? And people have ways of protecting themselves, like pushing the person away or stepping back. But when I find someone who doesn't protect their space, that's my target. Just like if you look like Jerry Sandusky, he recruited young boys who needed a father figure, right, who were emotionally needy for a positive male influence in their lives, and he exploited that. So perpetrators are very intentional in how they seek out vulnerable individuals. And they're almost always repeat offenders, and they may have plausible deniability. They also believe that they have plausible deniability. So if somebody is sexually intimate with me and then comes back to my apartment and then has alcohol with me, then I assume that that's a green light and that I have permission. So when I go ahead with my assumed permission and that person doesn't validate that, then I get angry. Or I will pass a lie detector test because I really thought that in that situation I was given permission and therefore my behavior was justified. So lie detector tests become meaningless in this case because I really thought that what I did was okay based on your behavior towards me and that you're playing with my mind or whatever. You're manipulating me because you're not fulfilling our agreement. But if the perpetrator, now here's another thing to think about. In order to get away with this crime, you have to have very good social skills. And if you're more likely to be successful with vulnerable individuals, that means in some way you have more power or status or believability than the individuals that you're perpetrating. And then if the victim is traumatized or was drinking or is going through a psychological crisis because of the event and they look disorganized, then we tend to not believe them. So there's almost like a whole setup that conspires to make predators look innocent and victims look guilty. And then, of course, when it's in higher education and the predator's an upstanding person, and now we get all these outraged parents who don't believe that their child could have done this. And if you look at what happened at the Stanford case recently, one important fact that came out of the investigation, after the boy's father wrote this public letter about his son was such a great human being and it's such a terrible thing because of just one mistake on one night, the investigation showed that he was making women uncomfortable successively at many previous events. So it wasn't an isolated event. And I'll tell you an interesting anecdote. I was doing a presentation at a college in Ohio near where he grew up. And a gay man on their campus told me that when he was in high school, the same person attacked him with homophobic comments on Facebook. So even though the person may appear to be a good citizen who has a good career, who's going to contribute to society, and this arbitrary accusation is destroying their life, it almost is never that way. But it looks that way. So because it looks that way, we jump to conclusions, which is why we have to go back to the beginning and say every victim deserves to be believed, or every report deserves to be believed, but we also have to have due process. So perpetrators care more about what men think than what women think, which is why men can have a bigger influence on them than women, and they account for 95%. And we know that in most cases they don't use a weapon, and they're from all racial and ethnic groups, so that's a whole other training to dispel our stereotypes about who assaults who. And they may be highly respected. And they believe, now here this is important, if I believe that it's okay to have sex with a woman when she dances with me a certain way, or when she flirts with me, or when we have certain consensual amount of sex, and I believe that gives me permission to what we used to call when we were teenagers, go all the way, then I also am more likely to believe that other men agree with me. And because I believe that other men agree with me, I'm more likely to do it. But in fact, other men don't agree with me. So if we tell the perpetrators that what other men really think about the types of things they do, they're less likely to do it. So that's the cognitive distortion, right? So we need to give perpetrators correct information about how other men feel about their behavior, because they care about other men. We need to correct misperceptions that keep bystanders from intervening, such as that people won't respect me, or my friends will think I'm ruining someone's chances. We need to teach bystanders to actively intervene, and I put this in parentheses because it's not true prevention, but we do have responsibility in this community to teach people to reduce their risk. So a norm is an acceptability of an action or belief. It's an unspoken rule, right? So in Minnesota, we have what you call Minnesota nice, right? I call it Midwestern nice. So that's a norm. Now, there's a reason for that, which is if you grow up in a small farm town and everyone is very independent, and maybe I'm go to church with you, and I'm going to buy a car from you, or our child is in class together ever, there's a social value in teaching, in everyone being nice to each other. So the norm is what most people believe in as the unspoken rule of the group. And what happens when the norm is misperceived, then perpetrators have a justification for their behavior, it influences other men's behavior, and it reinforces victim blaming. So when I think that most people think that it's okay to have sex with a drunk woman if she goes home with you, then when someone's bragging about it, I'm not going to say something, because I think that everyone else thinks it's okay. But if I know that most of you also don't think that's okay, I might be more willing to say something. We could talk about later, what would I say, how would I say it? So this is just what the research shows really quickly. Students overestimate the frequency and number of sexual partners of other students. On most college campuses, 30 to 40% of students are sexually abstinent by choice. Okay? Belief in rapists, willingness to use force, having sex without consent, and perpetrators overestimate more than others. And men underestimate other men's discomfort, willingness to intervene. So what we're doing is we're sitting in a room and we're thinking all these things about each other that aren't true. And because we're thinking all these things about each other that aren't true, we're acting differently than we want to act. So the good news is that the way we want to act is healthy, is noteworthy, whatever word you want to use. The way most people want to act is good, but the way people actually act doesn't always express that, which goes back to the thrive metaphor, because I'm not thriving if I don't say something when I hear a homophobic remark, because that bothers me. And it's bad for me to not say anything as well as the person who's the target. And this is partly what feeds into it. So here's two fancy words, just to show you that I really did earn my PhD. So, pluralistic ignorance is when the majority thinks it's a minority, but it's a majority. So most men would respect someone who intervened to prevent a sexual assault, but most men think that most men wouldn't respect someone. So I respect someone, but I'm in the minority, because I think all of you wouldn't respect someone, but that's erroneous. Really, all of you would respect. So we call that ignorance of the plurality. False consensus is when you're in the minority, but you think you're in the majority. So I think I'm speaking for everyone when I'm really only speaking for a subgroup. But because the rest of you were silent, I keep thinking that I'm speaking for everyone. This happens in politics a lot, right? So men are less likely to intervene, and men are more willing to assault when we are in this environment with all of these misperceptions. And victim blaming is increased also when we have all these misperceptions. Because, like I said, if you think of Minnesota nice, it's not wrong that we're social creatures. It's not wrong that we care about each other. It's not wrong that we take each other into consideration, and then I try and take into consideration what I think you think. I think that's great. The problem is when I think, when what I think you think isn't true. That's the problem. And, you know, I write boring articles and with 4 pages of references, and there's hundreds of those references documenting this. You know, but I think for this group, I'm not trying to like impress you with my academic prowess, but everything I'm telling you is based on the science. You know, is based on the research. So I want to just give you an example. There's a social norms campaign we did at Florida State. It's very typical of what you would find everywhere. So we asked men, do you agree or disagree with the following statement? And this is the percent who disagree. 79% disagree with the statement that it is only women who dress suggestively that are raped. But only 44% think that most men disagree with that. So you see the pluralistic ignorance? I disagree with it, but I think that most of you don't agree with my disagreement. Same thing for the rest. Okay, now, this is a Planned Parenthood of New York study. They were trying to address teenage pregnancy in a middle school. Like, if you think about that, it's kind of shocking. Like, why should we even have to preventing 11 or 12 or 13-year-olds from having sex and getting pregnant? And they decided to use this approach, a social norms approach. So they asked 8th grade girls, by the end of 8th grade, how many girls do you think have had sexual intercourse? So this is what we call the perceived norm, what girls think girls do. So if you look at the orange, you see that more than half thought that half or more had had sex, right? So then the question is, how many had actually had sex? And the answer is only 22%. Now, when I say only, I cringe because 22% is way too much from my point of view. But it's only compared to what people think. Relatively speaking, now here's what's important. See that 8% that said almost all had had sex? Those girls are 10 times more likely to have had sex. And I'll tell you a little anecdote. So when I go somewhere and I have family, I also take the opportunity to visit my family. So I have a cousin in San Diego, and I was going to University of San Diego, California at San Diego, which has done a lot of good work on this, and he had to drive his daughter to the movie theater because she had a date. So she's in the back seat, she's a high school senior, and my cousin and I are in the front seat, and she's like, well, what are you doing in San Diego? So I'm trying to explain all this to him in like 1 minute. So as I'm explaining this, you could hear her. She's like, finally she says, that's not true. Most of my friends have had sex. Now what happens is when you're confronted with this, you don't really know how to respond, but after you get practice, it becomes easy. So it's easier for me because I've been doing this for like 30 years, but it will become much easier for all of you. So what did I say? I said, okay, let me ask you a question. Think of your closest girlfriends that you would know for sure if they had had sex. Because they would tell you how many of them had had sex. And it was so quiet, you could hear a pin drop. And you could hear her, you know, like when your computer's making all these noises, but you don't know what it's doing. You could hear her going through them by, like in her head, she was going through each one by one, of her closest girlfriends. And finally, this very sheepish voice from the back seat said, "I guess you're right." So that would be an example, right, of the perception and the reality are different. So what's the perception based on? Have you ever heard anyone bragging about not having sex with someone? Right? Have you ever heard anyone say, "I met someone, we were really attracted to each other, we really had a good chemistry, but we decided that we wanted to get to know each other better before we were intimate"? Have anyone heard that? People don't talk about that, but that's actually very common. Do people talk about the fact that maybe 30 or 40% of your students are abstinent? We don't talk about it. So what do we talk about? What we talk about creates the impression, just like, I'll pick on Dean Finnegan since he's my host, okay? And anyway, this would appear to be very unlikely behavior. Let's say we have a social event for me as your guest tonight, and he and I get drunk. What are you all going to be talking about the next day? You're going to be talking about what a crazy party it was and how drunk we got. But maybe like 30% of you didn't drink, 40% of you had one drink, and maybe 3 people at the party got drunk. But everyone talks about the 3 people that got drunk. So one of the reasons we're all part of this problem is because of how we talk about the problem. There are some people closer in age to me who remember this phrase in the 60s, "You're either part of the solution or you're part of the problem." Well, here's a better version of it. You can't be part of the solution until you understand how you are part of the problem. So if you talk about the party as if it was a wild party because Dean Finnegan and I got drunk, and of course we'll admit that if the two of us got drunk, it would be an attention-getting phenomenon, right? But would you say, "I can't believe they invited this guy Berkowitz and he and the dean got drunk last night, but in general, it was a really quiet party"? We don't say that other part. It was just them that ruined it for everyone. So we're all part of the problem because of how we talk about the problem. So when we think, for instance, of the Stanford case, everyone talks about how he was such a promising person, how he was such a good student, how he was such a good athlete, how he was such an upstanding citizen. And the people who are overly attached to the belief in false accusations have more empathy for him than for the victim. Now, in that case, the victim was incredibly heroic, and she published a public letter to the father that said, "What about me? What about my trauma? I just went to that party that night to accompany my sister. I didn't even want to go." And in the Stanford case, it's very interesting because you had 2 bystanders who intervened, and he tried to run away. So there's the answer. Discussion over. What was he running away for if he wasn't doing anything wrong? Like, let's ask his father that. And I'm not trying to be insensitive to the parents because we invest a lot of effort in our children and we believe in the good of our children, but very often, especially in this case, there's something hidden from us that we don't know that doesn't fit the image we have of our child. So then when our child is accused, we're shocked, and if we have the resources, we get big lawyers, and the lawyers show up at the hearings, or they talk to one of your regents, right? Which is why your president needs to be trained to talk to a regent who feels that one of your students is being falsely accused. So it's really why it really is a community issue. And if the president, which I don't think is true of your president, good news for you, if the president caves into the pressure of the regent and lets that person play an athletic event or something else, then the whole effort caves in because people aren't walking the walk. Okay, so they made this poster in this middle school, and they didn't want to make a poster said that, "Guess what, y'all? 88% of you didn't have sex." Like, that wouldn't really fly well in a middle school. So instead of telling the behavior, they told the attitude. So they asked the kids, "When do you think it's okay for 2 people to have sex? Kids your age, kids in high school, 2 older adults in a serious relationship, or 2 older adults who are legally married?" And what the kids in the school said, 2 older adults married or not. So they made a poster that said, the truth is most PS 140 6th to 8th graders think sex is for adults. So this is what we call a social norms media campaign, where you tell the group, so maybe we could have a poster that said, 87% of University of Minnesota men would intervene if they saw someone in a risky sexual situation. So that's one of your tools that you could use as part of this effort. The question is, if you have a very heterogeneous community, maybe it's better to do it by college or by group or one for the whole campus and then one specific one for medical students or for athletes or for whatever. So here's another one. How do you think most kids in your grade feel when they hear another kid making sexual comments about someone in public? So the majority think that most kids think that other kids either don't care or think it's funny. But most kids actually want it to stop. Now, if we're talking about middle school, what would we want them to do? Kids say you can tell an adult, you could tell a parent, you could tell the teacher, you could tell the person to stop, you could express sympathy for the target. All of those things are less likely when they believe that most kids don't want it to stop. So far, so good? Each of these things could be like a whole 2 hours. So that's why it's just giving you, it's like a tapas bar, right? It's just a little taste of each one to whet your appetite. So, what does it mean to be a bystander? First, you have to notice the event. This is an event that's becoming noticed, but it wasn't previously noticed. Now it's coming out in the open. It doesn't mean the problem is getting worse. That's another issue for this institution. Let's say we do a really good job on this, and in 2 years, your reports of sexual assault triple. And now suddenly, in your Clery statistics, you have the most sexual assaults of any institution in Minnesota. All the news reporters with the satellite dishes are going to be right outside. And we're going to have to train someone to be able to say, there's a serious problem, and we're actually really glad that the reports are going up because more people are telling us what happened to them, and less people are suffering, and we could do something about it. You have to interpret it as a problem. So a lot of things, people make comments, and we don't take it seriously. We don't think it's a problem. People make a racial or an ethnic comment or another comment, and we notice it, but we don't realize how un-okay it is. If you notice it and you think it's a problem, you still have to feel, well, it's my job to do something. Like, I should say something, but usually we look around and well, he'll say something. He's the dean. It's his job. So now I don't have to do anything. He has to deal with all the... I have to say this carefully. Excuse me. Anyone who might sexually harass a graduate student, any faculty member in the School of Public Health, is his problem. The rest of us faculty don't have to do anything. That's called diffusion of responsibility. Because what happens is, we all see it and we don't do anything, and then it becomes a case, and then he spends 60 hours on it, and the university consumes all these resources, and all of us could have prevented it because we were uncomfortable for the last 5 years. Then you have to have the skills to act. So that's an important piece, is how do you intervene? So why are people bystanders, right? If most of us want to do the right thing, why don't we? First, you don't see anyone else doing anything, so you think, well, maybe it's not so serious, or maybe I'm overreacting, or maybe no one else minds. Because, as I said, our nervous systems are programmed to pay attention to other people and their reactions. So you're at a meeting and someone makes a remark that bothers you, and you look around and you don't see anyone looking upset. But if it was a cartoon, you would see that most people were upset and thought that most people weren't upset. Because in the cartoon, you could read what people are thinking. You don't want to embarrass yourself for someone else. Well, that's legitimate. That's part of why we have Minnesota Nice. We're not trying to embarrass anyone or ourselves. We assume that someone else will do something, like it's the dean's job, right, if he's in the School of Public Health. Or we believe that others aren't bothered, right, which is the social norms piece. that the first one is you don't look upset because I don't see you do anything, and this one is I incorrectly assume that you're not bothered. And the last one is fear of retaliation. Well, that's legitimate if there's a physical difference in size, if there's a cultural difference, if there's a power difference, if there's an age difference, if one person is in a more vulnerable group. There's many, many reasons why people don't intervene that, let's say, make sense. So, what are you going to do? Now, first, I have to ask you a question. Part of the really welcoming reception that I got when I came here was I got a bag with like all these goodies from my room in the hotel, and they gave me this t-shirt. So I want to show you this t-shirt. Keep Minnesota passive-aggressive, right? And in case you don't know how to be passive-aggressive, it says, or not, whatever you think is best. Okay? Now, this is my analysis. Minnesota nice really isn't passive-aggressive. Passive-aggressive is when you're cranky and you're Minnesota nice. So then you don't really like it, but you don't want to be rude, right? So the problem is, how do you intervene as a bystander and be Minnesota nice? Now, what usually happens, I have to deal with the stereotype, which is now I'm from California, but I used to live in New York. I spent most of my life in New York. So people think you're inviting this guy from New York to teach you about bystander intervention. It's not this. It's like, how dare you talk to me that way? Don't you ever use that word again in front of me, right? That's what people think bystander intervention is. It doesn't have to be that way. It could be that way. You could be upset enough that you would talk that way, but you don't have to. You can be Minnesota nice and still intervene. That's the main point I want to make, okay? So let's talk about how to do that. What are your options? You could talk to the person or you could talk to the other bystanders. If I make an offensive remark, let's say I say something stereotypical about Midwesterners, because look, you have to have compassion for me. I lived in New York and California, and the Midwest is just this place in the middle that makes the plane ride really long, right? And whatever stereotypes I inherited. So I make an offensive remark, and you go, I can't believe he said that. She said all these good things about him, and look what he just said. But you don't think anyone else minded. So after the talk, you say, what did you think about that comment Alan Berkowitz made? And you talk to each other, and you find out, oh, other people also didn't like it. Now, that wouldn't be a good strategy in a dangerous situation, to wait until after, but during the dangerous situation, you could check in with other people, because we know that when you share concern with other people, you're more likely to do something, and you're more likely to do something effective because you have more people thinking about it. So you could say something directly to me, or you could talk to the other bystanders. And then you decide, well, one of you is going to say something to me, or you're going to ask the dean to say something to me, or whatever. Then you have a conversation about your strategy. You could do something now or later. So if I said something really offensive, maybe one of you would raise your hand and you say, that's not really true about Minnesotans. We're really not always so nice as you think, right? Whatever. That would be in the moment intervention. And then how could you intervene? You could do what I just did, which is, that really upsets me and I don't like it, which is also good to do when you have authority. If you're in a position of authority and you let something go in front of you, it isn't good because then other people think you don't care. So when you're in a position of authority, you need to do something and say, that's not unacceptable and we'll talk about it later, or whatever. You can shift the focus. So we're going to go through this in detail, but this is the Minnesota nice way of not being a bystander. And then you could have a conversation with the person. You could say, like, Alan, I'm curious, what do you think about folks from the Midwest? And then I start telling you more, and you say, oh, that's really interesting. Where do you get that idea? And we have a whole conversation. And then at the end of the conversation, well, that's actually not true. Most of us are not farmers. You know, whatever. You give me the information that contradicts my assumption, but you only do that after listening to me and hearing me out. Because when I feel listened to by you, I'm more likely to listen to you when you have something to tell me. And the idea is to have more options for responding and to feel better that you did something so that more people do something more often, which creates the inhibiting environment for the perpetrator. So what are the ingredients? There's a context or relationship. The context might just be that we all work and go to school here. So we all care about this place. So if I see you littering, I'll say something. Actually, before where I live now, I lived in a very small town, and it was really nice because I could get up in the morning and go have a cup of coffee, go to the post office, go to the supermarket, and then go back to my apartment. So one day I was walking across the parking lot, and there were some teenagers in the corner, and they were littering, and it just inflamed me. Like, I got so upset, and it was all this stereotypical things going on in my head. And I felt I had to say something. So I walked over very slowly, and while I was walking over, I was like cooling myself down. So by the time I got there, I said, oh, would you like me to pick this up for you and throw it away? Oh, no, we'll pick it up. And they picked it all up. So that was an indirect intervention, because I didn't confront them. But what was the context? The context was, we all live in this place, and when people litter, it affects all of us. So the context can be very tenuous, and you can even create a context. I don't have time to give you all my good stories, but I have all these clips on my website of different interventions I've done. Like, I'll give you one really quick, just for fun, because it's fun. So once the flight attendant in a really small plane said something that I really thought was offensive, because there were 4 men sitting in the emergency row. It was a 2x2 plane. And he had to come give his spiel, like, are you willing and able, blah, blah. So he was trying to be funny. So he said, because if you guys aren't up for it, I could ask some women to sit here. That was supposed to be a put down or arouse our rescuing intentions. So I really felt I had to say something. And when he was giving me my water, he looked at me, he said, is everything okay? Because he could see I wasn't okay with him. But I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything. So finally I decided I would say something, and he was sitting in his seat at the front, and I pretended I had to go to the bathroom. So I went up to the bathroom, and he was there, and I said, oh, by the way, I notice you have a great sense of humor about your job. And he said, yeah, this job is so boring. You have to say things over and over again. People can't stand it. I like to add humor. And I said, that's great. I think that's great. I'm one of those bored people. I said, I really appreciate that. But I'm just curious, why did you make that comment about, if the men can't do it, you'll ask some women? And he gave me some explanation, and I said, I think what you're doing is really great. And as a person who flies a lot, I really appreciate it. But I wouldn't say that again, because that could be interpreted as a sexist remark, and I'm sure you don't mean it that way. And then I pretended to go to the bathroom, right? So I created a context to be able to, I had a conversation with him that created a context for me to say something, and I did it in an indirect way, which you all could tell me if that was still Minnesota nice. So that's called an indirect intervention. You feel something needs to be addressed, you're involved in the situation, you're willing to change something. And different situations, right, might require different responses, which is why no one can tell you what to do. Confrontation, we know. You say this is unacceptable, or you're really upset and you express yourself. If you're really upset and you express yourself, that might be really good for you because it's therapeutic, and I would encourage you to do it if you need to do it, but it might not change the other person's behavior unless they care about your being upset, right? Okay, this is the Minnesota nice. You cannot participate. You can change the subject. So, let me think of an example. I'm on a faculty committee and we're doing a search, and we're reviewing the applications of some female applicants, and one of my colleagues makes a comment that, don't you think we've hired enough women already? Like this, people are getting carried away with this affirmative action business. And I say, I was driving to work this morning and there were all these pro and con signs about the Ford land, and I don't know what to do. I don't know what I think. Now, that might seem like a cop-out, right? Some people who are really activists will say that's a cop-out and you're not addressing the issue, but you know what? If I change a subject, most people will start talking about the change of the subject because they don't like the remark. So even if I'm not addressing it directly, I'm addressing it indirectly by creating an environment in which that comment is not welcome. And very often you could also go another step where I would say, well, did you notice 4 of the 6 faculty that won teaching awards last year were female? Because what's the assumption? The assumption is that women don't make as good professors as men. Maybe in certain disciplines that stereotype is more prevalent. And we're only doing it because of some compliance issue. And if we didn't hire so many women, we would have a better university. So then I say something to that person that contradicts the assumption. Now, it has to be true that 4 of the 6 people who got the teaching awards, so you have to have the information. But the point is, that's an indirect intervention that silences the remark that doesn't create an uncomfortable situation, which I think is Minnesota nice, but you will have to tell me later if I understand it well enough, right? Or, as I said, you could have a conversation with the person and say, really, why do you think that way? And the person talks to you, and maybe they worked in a department once where there were some female professors who weren't competent as they should be, and that was actually happened, but then you could say, well, that's interesting because my experience is completely the opposite, and so then you have a conversation. You don't do that with someone who's toxic, who only wants to complain, but you do that with someone that's willing to engage in a conversation. So the point is you have all these options. You could say, am I going to intervene or not? Maybe you have young children, you're late to pick them up at daycare, you run into the grocery store to buy something, that someone makes a comment at the checkout that is offensive, and you say, I'm not going to say anything because my kid is already late and people are waiting to go home until I pick my kid up. Sometimes you might decide to not intervene. If you decide to intervene, you can intervene now or later, either later after the incident or later on in the incident. You could talk to the person or you could talk to the other bystanders and see how they're feeling, because we know that you might not have accurate information about what the other bystanders are feeling, and they might actually also want to do something. If you talk to the person, you have all these options, right? You can say, that's not acceptable, don't use that word around me, or you can do something indirect, or you could say, could you tell me why you feel that way? It seems like this really bothers you. Like I could say to my colleague, every time affirmative action comes up, it seems like you get really upset. Could you tell me why you're so upset about it? Who knows? Maybe that person has a parent who lost a job because of affirmative action, and they feel hurt by it, even though we might feel it's good for society, and that in almost all cases it isn't about unfairness, it's about identifying the most qualified people for the job, and the systems we had to do that in the past weren't accurate. If you talk to other bystanders, you could say, what did you think of that? Did it bother you? What can we do about it? Let's decide Alan is the best person to talk to so-and-so because he co-published 3 articles with them, whatever. And you might also reach out to the target and say, that was really unacceptable. I really was upset by how that can be very powerful for someone. And then you decide what to do. Now here's the missing piece that most people don't do, which is very important, especially for people in a leadership position. After you've done something, you go back to other people and say, how do you think I handled that? Like, was that a good response? What would you have done if I wasn't here? So you use the incident to train the other people who were bystanders to not be bystanders. Now, here's an important thing. I don't have time to go into the research. The research shows that bystander intervention programs result in people intervening more, and then it goes away. We call that a rebound. It gets better, and then it spikes, and then it goes back to where it was. Why is that? Because we're not following up with people. Maybe John said something to me and it didn't go well. And so the next time he doesn't want to say anything to me because he doesn't want to embarrass me or himself or the institution. So he needs to sit down with someone and say, well, what did you say to Alan, and what else could you have said, and did you try this? And, oh, I could have said that. Actually, last night at dinner, we were brainstorming how to do Minnesota nice. So I gave an example. I said, well, what if you live in a small town and you see that I'm arrested for DWI? It's in the newspaper, everyone knows. Would you say anything to me? And it wasn't John, just to let you know that it wasn't him. Someone else said, no, I wouldn't say anything. And I said, well, could you say this? No. Could you say this? No. So then I said, could you say this? Like, oh, I saw you had a brush with the law last week. Yeah, I could say that. So it's like you have to figure out what you could say. And then once you say that, you open the door. Maybe the person says more, and then maybe you can say more. And maybe you could have a real conversation about their alcoholism, or maybe not. But the point is, you have to do something that fits in with the culture and with people's comfort, and you have to figure out what it is that you can do. And that might also be different for different cultures, right? Like we don't have as much Minnesota nice in New York, but we might be nicer than you think, right? So, you know, like people from the Midwest go to New York City and they're like, the people were so nice, I can't believe it. So you do something, and then you follow up and get feedback, and you discuss it with people so you don't have that rebound. So that would be part of my recommendations, is that you have to have some ongoing process for reviewing and discussing and improving it when people try and intervene. So you need to reduce the barriers, correct the misperceptions, teach a range of intervention skills, provide mentorship and practice, and create a campus culture that supports intervention. So for instance, one of my recommendations would be, anytime you have any kind of incident, you sit down with all the people afterwards and you talk about who were the bystanders who could have intervened. Let's say I'm busted by your public safety for open container, right? I'm 17 years old and I'm standing out in the public with a beer in my hand and I get busted. We train the officer to say, Alan, I don't want to know any names, but were you drinking with any of your other friends? And I say, yeah. And you say, well, did anyone see you walk out on the street with an open beer? Yeah. I say, well, do you realize that I wouldn't be talking to you if they had stopped you? So you train everyone to think in terms of who could have intervened that didn't. Okay, now we're going to switch gears. And we're going to talk about, the last part will be just to give you a taste of what works based on the science of prevention. Because sexual assault is, for the most part, a gendered crime or a gender-based crime, and because the men who sexually assault care more about what other men think, and also because we want to create a safe environment for victims to come forward, the research is very clear that separate gender programs led by same-gender facilitators are better. In general. Nothing is a blanket statement. So maybe for some of your gender questioning communities or other communities, you design a sexual assault prevention workshop that doesn't assume a gender binary. But for most of your students who live in a gender binary, you design a separate workshop for males and females. This might not be true as people get younger, so this might not be necessary in middle school, but it works better this way in this age group. You want to focus on the responsibility of bystanders in addition to taking care of yourself. We want to use peers in interactive formats. And we want to create environments that inhibit perpetrators. And we need to talk about male victimization because there's also 10 to 15% of men are victims as well. And that's much harder for men to talk about themselves as victims than women. Also, which confirms that it's gender-based violence, because the stereotypes about masculinity is that, well, why did you let that happen to you? Or why didn't you do something? So, or, you know, if a male is perpetrated by a female, it's like, well, why didn't you just enjoy it? I mean, people say all these really stupid things. So the barriers for male victims are even greater. Not that the barriers for female victims aren't great. So we need to at least acknowledge that we have male victims. And we want to say to men, we need your help. Let's say we're doing something with athletes or Greeks or whatever. We say, you're respected on this campus and you're a leader, and we know that most of your team wouldn't take advantage of someone, but we need your help because this is a really big problem and you could play a big role in solving it. What's really good about that is when you create an environment where you have really honest discussion among men, and men say what they really feel, the men say things that corrects the perpetrator's assumptions about what the other men think. So it serves to inhibit the perpetrator to say, that doesn't matter, that's rape, you shouldn't do that. And then the guy starts saying all the healthy things that they actually believe, and you reinforce the healthy norm. You emphasize the role of mere appeal culture, so you examine men's discomfort with how they're taught to be men, and you correct men's misperceptions, and you teach at risk and self-defense, but you don't call that prevention. So let's ask ourselves a question. Because now we're like at the beginning of a long-term effort. So how do we teach this whole community to notice the event, interpret it as a problem, feel responsible for dealing with it, and have the skills to act? And that's for all forms of gender-based violence, right? Faculty, graduate student, faculty, staff, faculty, anything we could think of. We want to get everyone to go through these stages. And how do we teach and mentor bystander intervention skills so it doesn't go away, and how do we reduce the misperceptions? So going back to that poster I showed you, one way we reduce misperceptions is we put up all these posters telling the truth, and then when people don't believe them, because everyone thought it was a really wild party, we have a conversation about it, and we find out, and they say, oh, so really only Alan and John were dancing on the table. And most people were actually pretty chilled. Yeah, that's right, you're right. So if that were a true story, you should talk about us getting drunk, right? Because we're not supposed to do that. But you talk about it in the right way that contextualizes the behavior and doesn't exaggerate it. So the social norms and bystander intervention are both promising best practices. There's a lot of research in support of them. And the research shows that the two work better together than either alone, because I hope I've made it clear, one of the biggest things that inhibits bystanders from intervening is what you think other people think. So correcting the misperception lowers the barrier. Violence is gendered and a gendered approach is necessary, but we also need to allow for a questioning of gender assumptions. It's both and. We live in a society that is an either-or society, right? If someone has a late-night talk show and they bring in someone who's a scholar on the Holocaust, they feel morally they need to bring in someone who denies the Holocaust. Those aren't two equal points of view, right? Those aren't two equally valid points of view. Those 2 points of view don't have the same evidence base. But somehow we always frame everything as either or, and we need to think both and. How do I address this problem as a gendered problem, and I call it gender-based violence, but I still acknowledge that on this campus there are people who are not conforming to those gender stereotypes and who question whether or not they even, quote, really exist. Interactive tailored programs are more effective when they're reinforced by synergistic efforts. So we have a workshop for your athletes or your Greeks or your international students. International students from non-Western countries are especially at risk because the way people dress and express their sexuality in this culture means something different in their culture of origin. And when they come here, it can be very confusing. And if where I grew up, dressing a certain way means a certain thing, it might not mean that here. So let's say we have tailored individual programs for all these groups, but we still have a uniform campus-wide effort that reinforces the messages we're delivering in the tailored programs. And the research shows that the reason I put this bullet up is for alcohol use, correcting the misperception by itself can reduce alcohol use. Because alcohol is a different kind of behavior. But for violence, correcting the misperception by itself doesn't reduce violence. But correcting the misperception and teaching bystander intervention reduces violence. So I want to give some case studies in the last 10 or 15 minutes, just to see, for you to see like how we put this all together. So this is one of the top researchers in the field is named Chris Gittich from Ohio University. If some of you remember, the original article, study that really talked about date rape was in Ms. magazine. It was a study commissioned by Ms. That was her thesis. Her advisor is Mary Koss, who's one of the greats in this field. So Chris was interested in what I was doing, and she got a CDC grant to test my model of rape prevention, but she's also one of the pioneers in risk reduction. So we had first-year students at Ohio University. The men got a rape prevention workshop that I designed, and the women got a risk reduction workshop that she designed. And in other residence halls, they got nothing. That was the control group. So what do we find for the men? So we did all these things that I've been talking about, bystander intervention. We gave them normative feedback. What do you think most men in this group think? What do you think most men at Ohio U think, et cetera? And what do we find? The men thought that the other men would be more likely to intervene, including the sexually aggressive men. So let's say I'm one of these guys that perpetrated in high school, and now I'm a freshman at Ohio University, and you're all the men in this room are living with me in this dorm. You all are more likely to believe that each other would intervene against me, but I'm also more likely that you would intervene against me. So in a certain way, you're making me uncomfortable, which is fine. The men perceive less reinforcement from their peers for sexually aggressive behavior, including the sexually aggressive men. So I'm not getting encouragement. I'm not getting any points. People aren't listening to my jokes. I think this is great. The men were less likely to hang out with me. Like now I'm alone on Saturday night. You all decide that you'd rather go bowling or go to a movie and you don't want to hang out with me when you find out that you all would rather go bowling than hang out with me. Now, here's the really interesting thing. We reduced sexual assault in the experimental group by 75%. But it went away after 6 months. So I'm going to talk about that later. Now, here's an interesting thing. We didn't say anything about pornography. We didn't say one word about pornography. Pornography use went down. Who has an explanation? How do we change something that we didn't talk about? Here's my explanation. This is a hypothesis. Most guys don't like porn. Most guys don't want to see porn. But if you're a freshman and you have nothing to do on Saturday night, and I invite you all to come to my room and watch some porn flicks because my hard drive is loaded with them, and you think that other people think it's interesting, then you're all going to come in my room. But as soon as you know that you'd all rather go bowling or go to a movie or whatever, then I'm alone. So we actually reduced pornography, and it was a robust finding 6 months later without even mentioning the word. Now, my opinion is that any one workshop is not going to change someone for life. Anyone that you meet at a conference that wants to sell you a workshop or an online course or anything else that's going to end sexual assault, go somewhere else. Because there is no such thing. So my opinion is, if we did something that was effective that lasted 6 months, that was really good. And what else could we have done that could have made that last 1 year or 2 years or 4 years? That's where we need this whole community effort that we didn't have at Ohio University. We were just doing, a study. There's a high school campaign. It's a rural high school in the Berkshires in Massachusetts. So we asked boys, do you agree or disagree with the statement, I don't like it when boys trash talk about girls or women? So 83% of boys said that they didn't like it, but they thought that only 63% didn't like it. So the majority still thought that a majority was uncomfortable, but there's still the gap. So here's our poster. 4 to 5 guys really don't want to hear trash talk about girls. Now, one of the things we know about prevention is you need to give people something what to do. You just don't, first of all, you don't tell people what they shouldn't do. That doesn't work. That's like the knee-jerk reaction. Don't do this, don't do this. Domestic violence, we show pictures of battered women, whatever. That doesn't get people to engage in positive action. So we didn't ask in the survey, what do you do when you hear this? So we did focus groups, and then we said, here's what they do about it. Tell them to stop, leave the conversation, change the subject, warn their friends, warn the person being talked about. So we gave people some positive actions that they could do. We had a series of posters in which we said, 85% believe that couples should share decision-making, and then this is the final poster combining all the three posters, that more than 80% of you agree that in most relationships. Now here's an interesting thing. The next year on the survey, more students reported knowing someone in an abusive relationship. Because the campaign got them to norm what was a healthy relationship, so they were more likely to notice an unhealthy relationship. So we had more boys knowing that other boys want to have consent, or that reduced the misperception. We had more people reporting that had a friend who's been abused. We had more boys who would say they would do something when they heard trash talk. One last one. This one is at University of Central Missouri. It's designed for fraternities and sororities, and it's a very good example of how you tailor a program to the culture of a specific group. So they collect, they collect the data. All of this requires that you collect data, right? Anything with the social norms approach requires that you collect data. So if you don't have data, it doesn't mean you don't do anything, it means you don't do this. Now the researcher just said this is more powerful, this is like a stronger intervention, but you have to have the infrastructure to do it, which means you have to collect the data. So maybe you don't do this here for 3 years, but until then you do a lot of other things that bring you closer to the point where when you do this it will work. So they share the results with the chapter. So they take a survey, and if you're a member of a particular fraternity or sorority, now we have a workshop for your fraternity or sorority in which we tell you what you all told us, which is what we did at Ohio University. We have a media campaign, and this is really cool. They had a bystander intervention video contest, so you could win a prize if you designed a video of someone intervening, which is really cool, because take the 3 people in the front row. You all want to win the prize, so you're going to make a video. So what's the scenario? Who's going to intervene? How are you going to intervene? So as you're making up your video, you're going through this process to learn how to intervene effectively, because you're talking about it, and well, this person will do this, and then we'll do this, and then we'll do this, and then someone wins the prize. And they also did this as an in-class program, because on this campus they have like one of these freshman academic preparation courses for everyone. So it's 90 minutes, they tell them the theory and the data, they teach bystander, they use clickers. So if everyone here, you all know about clickers, if everyone had a clicker, I could say, do you click yes if you think it's really important to be Minnesota nice? And then I would say, click yes if you think most people in the room now think it's really important to be Minnesota nice. And then we would see if all of you were accurate in what you thought other people thought. It's very powerful because it's right in the moment. Then they did role plays. So they collected norms for alcohol. Now this is, I think, brilliant. It's basically saying, when would I like you to intervene against me? So Dean Finnegan, as the Dean of Public Health, says, I would like you to say something to me if I'm making a fool of myself at a party. So now you have permission. You don't have to worry about if it's okay with him. He already told you that if you see him doing this, he wants you to do something. To me, that's like brilliant. When you would intervene, and how much are you bothered? So here's an example. This is from a fraternity. If you noticed an intoxicated chapter member harassing or bothering someone, how much would it bother you? 73% say it would bother them very much, but the perception is that only 38% would be bothered very much. So right there's the misperception. This is, I think, great. What you want from your sorority sisters, 100%, this is, usually it's in the high 90s, but in this sorority it was 100% said that I want you to intervene if you see me doing any of these things. So then the question would be, no one has done something similar for sexual assault. What would the similar questions be for sexual assault? One of the things that's really gotten me excited about coming here is that because you're a research institution, we can create a whole huge research effort around this topic while you're engaging in effective prevention, and you could really up the science of sexual assault prevention by engaging your faculty in doing research on these things while we're designing a really effective long-term prevention program. So that's the poster they made. Did you know 85% think it's unacceptable to miss class due to alcohol? And if you just look at this carefully, you'll see that after 1 year, 5% more students said that they intervened in the last year. One of the problems there's a gap between science and practice. So what happens is really good programs like this don't get evaluated and don't get published. So the first program I showed you was a published article in a peer-reviewed journal, but the other two I showed you are just case studies that weren't evaluated. But the trend is very clear, and the research is very clear in favor of this. So what about leaders? As I said, the leader creates the environment, and the leader is an important part of the environment, so that the leader set a climate that inhibits or encourages. You know, like probably it wouldn't happen now, but around alcohol there was the old boys will be boys, you know, metaphor. So the leaders very often would enable the problematic environment by their comments and their behavior. It's very interesting when you go to a campus, when I go to a campus and there's an elephant in the room and something isn't right and I can't figure it out, and then I find out later that the president or a very high-ranking person is an alcoholic. And then it's like, well, how do you do effective alcohol abuse prevention on this campus when the real problem isn't being confronted? So that's rare, but the point is that's an extreme example of the effective leadership. Do leaders encourage bystanders to intervene? Now, let me say this. When you talk about bystander intervention, it should never be punitive. It should never be, I'm disappointed, I'm mad at you, I'm upset with you, you're being sanctioned because you didn't intervene. That just pushes the problem underground. It should be, I'm really glad you told me, let's talk through what you did and see if we could think of something that you would feel good about doing the next time. Is there too much focus on the problem? It's not that we can't talk about the problem, but when we only talk about the problem, we boost the misperception. And when more people think that more people do X, it gives more permission to do X. Is positive behavior rewarded and reinforced? What about all of you well-behaved people who are at the party, like no one's appreciating you? We're getting all the attention. You know, like, I'll give you another example since I have time. I was presenting this at a high school. In Illinois, did some really good high school social norms campaigns around alcohol. So we had what's called lunch and learn. So we give a little presentation during lunch and we give the teachers a free lunch. So I was presenting all this data and this woman raised her hand and she says, I don't believe any of this. So like I've learned, I don't get upset anymore like, oh no, what am I going to say? It's like, could you tell me why? Because I'm the president of the school board and every weekend I get 5 phone calls about out-of-control parties. So I said, okay, let's see if we can reconcile. You have your data, and I have this data. Let's see how we can fit them together. How many students do you think are at each party? 20. Okay, let's assume that all 20 students are drinking illegally, which is probably not correct. But just for the sake of discussion, let's assume. 5 times 20 is 100. How many students are in this high school? 1,500. So she has a problem as the school board chair, and it is true that there are problematic events occurring over the weekend, but it's not true that most students are not drinking or drinking responsibly. And we don't even, I remember when my daughter was in high school, there was going to be a graduation party, and there was a rumor that there was going to be drugs and alcohol, and my daughter and her friends were talking about how they're not going to go to that party. That's what we want. We don't have any data on that. So we need to reward positive behavior, and we need to have the leaders perceived as accessible and sympathetic to individuals who might have something to report. But it's a little more complicated because of mandatory reporting. But we still want people to come forward and then direct them to the people that can help them, such as the Aurora Center. And are the efforts visible and proactive? Well, that's what you're trying to do here. And who are the carriers of the misperception? So if I'm one of your faculty members and it's Monday and it looks like a lot of you are falling asleep, and I say, there's a lot of tired people in this room now, I bet you were all out drinking this weekend, I'm reinforcing the misperception because this one was doing their honors project, this one is on the hockey club and they only could get the ice at 5 a.m. You know, this one works in the student union. So when I make that comment, I'm reinforcing the misperception that most people drink. So it may be single or multiple issue. For example, in addition to sexual assault and sexual harassment, you could do a bystander campaign that addressed social injustice, that addressed high-risk drinking. You don't have to limit it to this issue. It contains multiple synergistic efforts, including curriculum infusion. So we find ways for the faculty. I mean, you have people on this campus who are teaching about pluralistic ignorance and false consensus, because those are like well-documented social scientific phenomenon. So we get those people involved. We address barriers and educate the community, such as about false accusation, the things I said in the beginning. When possible, it has an interactive component. So it's not always possible like now. But even now, we're going to go sit in those nice-looking chairs, and the dean and I are going to have a discussion based on your questions. It reaches students and staff through multiple channels and venues. It teaches leadership skills. It involves key stakeholders. So for example, in a state institution, many of the carriers of the misperception are the people I grew up with, because when I'm a senior in high school and I'm applying to colleges and I go to the barber might tell me certain stereotypes about this place. Or my friend's father, who was an alum here, and says, oh, that was a great party school. Well, that was in 1950, and that might have only been your friends, not everyone. But by everyone telling me that, that determines who actually wants to come here. So it might involve your alums. It uses an oversight coordinating committee, which you already have. It's sustained over time. So you can see that you should feel good about how this is starting off. Because how this is starting off right, in my opinion. Like I could say, the Gophers are digging deep. Can I say that? Okay, develops methods of measuring the problem, evaluating the changes, collecting the data. So we want to identify and support healthy norms, focus on bystanders, avoid scare tactics, create an environment that inhibits problem people, create programs that are mutually reinforcing, and educate the community about these controversial issues such as victim blaming and bystander intervention. And I won't repeat it, but a similar institution didn't see any empirical changes for 8 years. So sometimes, since you're building up momentum, it may be that in the beginning, if you do less, you accomplish more than if you try and do too much. You address the barriers. Now, the barriers might be the people in my hometown who say certain things about University of Minnesota. Or the barriers might be the regent who believes their best friend's child is falsely accused. Or the barrier might be that all of you are telling everyone it was a wild, out-of-control party. Or the barrier might be, how do I say something to this person and still be nice? Or the barrier might be, how do I confront someone who has a lot of power over me and can influence my job or my academic career? Which means we need to create a lot of safe avenues for people to report. How do we get everyone involved? Which is why this is a very good beginning right now in this room, and we still have to adjust the policy enforcement issues. Because look, I'll tell you another self-disclosure. This time I didn't have to drive to campus. But other times I've driven on the interstates in Minnesota and other states, I drive 9 miles over the speed limit. And in some people say, not in Minnesota, 5, only 5. But in general, the troopers have this expression, 9, you're fine, 10, you're mine. That's a state trooper, secret. So what's happening? There's a law and I'm breaking the law. But the law is modifying my behavior. The law, from from a legalistic point of view, I'm breaking the law. But from another point of view, I'm taking the law into account. I know I'm going to get busted. I don't want to get busted. So the law causes me to modify my behavior, and I drive more safely even though I don't drive legally. Okay, so that's the truth about Alan Berkowitz. In the case of sexual assault, it's the safest crime you could commit. It's the best crime to commit if you don't want to get caught. So we can't ignore the policy and the enforcement issues because it's a big part of the puzzle. So those are some of the boring articles I wrote, and thank you all very much. So did you have some questions you wanted to ask me?
Well, I have, yes, I think I have a few. Let me see if I got, I think this is on, right?
By the way, we were thinking, since there were so many questions, which is really great, that we'll find a way to respond to all the questions, which we won't be able to do now.
So if you do have questions that you put on those cards, if you want to pass them to the aisles, then we will have folks pick those up. Just hold them up there.
That's you.
That's me.
Yeah, that's you.
Must be
You
that
need to, the first step in bystander intervention is to notice the event, right? Put it lower.
I'm supposed to be better at this here for some reason. Okay, I think that works. Yes? No?
You notice he has a really cool one without the cord.
Yeah.
He's the dean, I'm a visitor.
See if I can get this back now. Okay. All right, well, we try not to make this too bad here. We have had a number of questions come to us online, and we've got some new ones here, and thank you very much for giving us those. Let me start with this one. How does exaggerated masculinity in American culture factor into sexual violence? Why don't we talk about this more?
So we should talk about this more. So the question is, how do you talk about it? Because if you talk about it in a way that puts men on the defensive, it's not effective. And we know that most men are uncomfortable with the way they're taught to be men. Like once in a workshop, I gave out cards and I had people write something about how you feel about how you were taught to be male or female. And some of the comments I got for men was, why can't boys cry? Or why can't guys dance with guys? Or things like that. So the point is, if most men are uncomfortable with the way we're taught to be men, and actually women are part of this too, because I remember once when I was in college, I saw this really emotional movie and I felt like crying. And I remember the woman I was with, she started getting really uncomfortable. You know, that was unmasculine of me or something. So she was inhibiting my behavior. So we need to talk about it in a positive way. But obviously, I hope I've made it clear that this is gender-based violence. And it is related to how we teach men to be men and women to be women. And even though most men and women don't act that way or believe in it, the whole gender-based discussion feeds into it. So for instance, let's say you want to invite a public speaker to campus to talk about gender socialization. That could be a good part of your efforts if you put it in the bigger context, because the gender socialization is something that contributes to the issue.
And this obviously has a lot to do with the culture issue in terms of change and so forth.
Yes.
It's not going to happen overnight.
Right.
Okay. Another question comes up. Factors like alcohol on campus increase the risk of sexual assault for all involved. How do we address this, especially when it seems like victim blaming? I think you addressed that a bit in the
So this is
talk.
a really complicated issue. And the only thing that I did talk about was how perpetrators use alcohol to make someone more vulnerable. And it's clear that a lot of sexual assaults involve alcohol, but not necessarily most. So that's the first thing. The research is that almost half involve alcohol. So what about the other half? The research is also very clear that alcohol does not cause sexual assault, because the person who would commit a sexual assault would do so with or without the alcohol. So if I'm using alcohol as a way to make someone vulnerable, then I will do that if someone will let me get them drunk. But if that person won't let me get them drunk, I'll do something else. So we need to be very clear. Alcohol does not cause sexual assault, but it creates risky environments in which sexual assault may be more likely to occur. So we need to talk about alcohol, but we need to be very careful how we talk about alcohol. Because if we don't talk about alcohol in the right way, we blame the victim who went out to get the pizza at 3 a.m. or who drank a lot and then was assaulted.
Good question here, and I think there may be an issue about whether we have good data to back this up. Has campus sexual assault increased over time?
That's a very hard question to answer because it's such a hidden crime. But what the research suggests is that it has not increased, but it's becoming more recognized. So as I said, when you look at all the barriers to reporting, huge amounts of assaults are not reported. And if you look at what happens in the criminal justice system, many victims don't want to go through what they go through when either the DA won't prosecute the charges or the jury won't believe them or whatever. So the more victims that come forward, the better, even though it's a challenge, and then we have a moral responsibility to provide the resources. So let's say we're really successful, and in 2 years the Aurora Center has a doubling in the amount of students that come for assistance, but we don't increase their staff. That would be not acceptable in my opinion. So, but we can't look at the reports increasing as problematic, and we don't think that it's getting worse. We just think it's getting more visible.
So this obviously begs the question then with some of the exemplar programs that you talked about, say SUNY Albany, as you get a program like this going on campus and you increase that visibility, and presumably that encourages more people who have been victims of sexual assault or survivors to come forward. So is doing a program like this, are we likely to see an increase in some of those statistics? Not because it's necessarily a real increase, but because that's part of making it more visible.
So let's say we made like a 10-year plan for University of Minnesota. So we assume that in the first 5 years, reports will spike. But we also assume is that we get all of our prevention efforts underway and we start really making a difference and we start creating an inhibiting environment for perpetrators, that eventually you'll start having less assaults. So that maybe after it spikes, at some point you'll find that the number of on-campus assaults going down. Or you might find that the spike stays because more and more people feel comfortable reporting. So what if you had 80% of your assaults reported? That would be great, but it might not look good when someone looks at the Cleary statistics and see that University of Minnesota had the most reported assaults. But over time, we believe that the prevention will work, and we also believe that it's good to have more reports. Because when you think of all these examples, and I gave the ones that were like very well known in the media of, you know, Bill Cosby having 22 people come forward, or Roger Ailes at CNN. Those are the public serial harassers and assaulters. You have many cases on college campus where one person makes a report and then other people come back and report the same person. And there's actually a really good web program that I don't remember the name, where you can file a confidential description of your assault, and if someone else files a confidential description of the same person, they put you in contact with each other with your permission. To me, that was like great, because now we have a chance to out the serial perpetrators.
After a sexual assault has occurred, how do we maintain the idea of innocent until proven guilty without creating sympathy for the perpetrator? what should our cultural response be?
So, right, we never said this was going to be easy, right? So, we know that if someone claims that they're assaulted, we have a right to offer them certain protections, like maybe this person isn't in your classes, or this person doesn't live in your residence hall, or we need to create certain safeties in the environment for the victim while still not assuming that the perpetrator is guilty. Now, some people will say that that's unfair to impose any constraints upon the accused person, but it's more complicated than that, because by not imposing constraints on the accused person, you're re-traumatizing the victim or the accuser, so you're putting one person's mental health above the other. And what's happening now in the public discussion is that the mental health of the accused perpetrator is being given greater value, like the father of the guy from Stanford, than the mental health. So you need to find a balance, but clearly, unless the person is found guilty, they still have a right to be a student, they still have a right to pursue their education, they still have their basic rights, but we constrain those temporarily in order to also protect the mental health of the accuser, who also has a right to her or his education, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a complicated both and that's not easy in practice, but we have to be willing to do things to ensure the safety and well-being of both, and not put too much attention only on the safety and well-being of the person who feels falsely accused, who might appear more credible and reliable than the person who's been through a trauma and is in a vulnerable identity. And I'll say one more thing. Because a real perpetrator, as opposed to falsely accused perpetrator, has a deviant personality, if I assault someone and you put a restriction on me that I cannot go to any public social events in the School of Public Health if this person who accused me is present, and I have to leave within 10 minutes, I'm going to try and stay there for 15 minutes because I really want to upset that person, because I'm mad at that person that they got me in trouble. So if you, as the dean, install a really good monitoring system, even though you can't kick me out for the assault, you can kick me out for violating the terms of my probation. So it means putting a really good system in place and understanding the mentality of perpetrators, and even if you can't bust me for A, you can bust me for B. Now, what usually happens when an extreme event happens, such as you had on this campus in recent past, everyone gets into a big argument over whether or not the extreme event happened. Like, was the sex consensual or not? But in the meantime, there was a whole host of unacceptable misbehaviors that we would not accept for a University of Minnesota student or athlete or leader. So we need to punish everything that's punishable, and not only focus on the extreme charge that is the hardest to prove. That's a problem for the whole culture.
Mm-hmm. So, Alan, one other question had to do with the perpetrators and the profile. Are these folks able to be rehabilitated?
That's another difficult question. Let's just say, for brevity, it's possible, but it's difficult.
Okay, all right.
But that's a whole other discussion.
So our population of students is extremely heterogeneous. We have young people coming into college, and they're moving from their teen years to their young adult years, and we have graduate students that are generally older and are pursuing greater degrees or graduate professional degrees. So 2 questions, one on the graduate students and one on the incoming undergrads. And here's the undergrad question. Is there a single best intervention to reduce assault among incoming first-year students?
Well, even your president this morning said there's no silver bullet, right? So we could rephrase the question and say, if we want to do something for our incoming students, what's the most effective thing we could do? But what happens when you get stuck in a compliance mentality, which is what's happening in higher education now, we want to be legal and not get in trouble and not get on the Department of Education's list. So we focus exclusively on compliance, and then we just go down checking the list. So the best thing for incoming students is consistent with what I said, which is tell them the true norms for their class, for the institution, teach them about intervening and not being bystanders. You know, all of the above should be incorporated into a first-year student orientation. And if, for instance, you're only bringing in a popular speaker, let's say you're bringing a very dynamic motivational speaker, then you give your person the data. You say, here's the data we have for University of Minnesota. Would you talk about this? And if that person just has a canned presentation that they give everywhere and they're not going to listen to you, then say, we'll get back to you in 2 weeks because we're talking to other speakers, and you find a speaker who's willing to support your institutional agenda.
So the graduate student question, graduate student-faculty relations seem to have their own unique challenges. Graduate students are highly dependent on the mentorship of their faculty for professional advancement and also look to them to learn social norms in the academy. There's a description of a challenge going on at the University of Rochester in New York. What can faculty, staff, and students do here so that our students recognize that this kind of behavior isn't the norm, and if you are altering your educational plans and opportunities to avoid becoming a target, that this is problematic as well?
Very problematic. So remember, we need to notice the event, interpret it as a problem, feel responsible for dealing with it. And this event of, let's call it exploitation of graduate students, is now coming into our radar. And we know that that's a very vulnerable relationship because there's a significant power differential and there's huge barriers to intervention. So I would say, first of all, when we look at the profiles of perpetrators, the person who perpetrates is also the person who's likely to make the comment about affirmative action in the search committee meeting. So if my department starts confronting me on the affiliated behaviors, it's creating a more inhibiting environment for me, but we also need to give our graduate student resources and places to go to report this without feeling that they're going to be sanctioned.
Yeah.
So it's once again, it's multiple things that you need to give the victims a place to go and talk to someone about it. And then maybe in the case of changing someone's class or residence to protect them from being in touch with the perpetrator, maybe someone has a research stipend with that professor, and it means finding them other means to support themselves financially and pursue their degree and giving them a chance to change their advisor.
This is a question that relates to the structure, if you will, of the organization. How can the university restructure its governance of fraternities and other university-affiliated groups so that cases of sexual harassment and assault do not fall into the hands of leadership that isn't accountable?
So that's a loaded question because the leadership has to be accountable, right? So that shows us the problem right there. The leadership has to be accountable and there have to be effective interventions, but then you could also do things to change the environment. Like I'll give you an example. Many national fraternities do not have the financial resources to support the physical maintenance of the houses. So in some institutions, they've created a corporation of alums that buys the houses and rents them back to the fraternities. Now you have control because you're the owner. Right. So it's not only one thing, it's everything all together. So we hold the leadership accountable. Part of the reason the leadership of these organizations aren't accountable is because they incorrectly think that most of their members don't support them, because in the chapter meetings, the only two people who speak up are me and the dean, who brag about how drunk we got at the party last night, and then everyone else is silent. So it's at all levels. If you go back to that first picture of the CDCs, all the colored circles, it's all these things in each one of those circles that makes a difference together, including holding the leaders accountable.
This may be a difficult question to answer, but
that's a good question.
Yeah, is the political situation in the country, in which hate crimes seem to be on the rise, also affecting sexual assaults? Is there a relationship, I suppose, is what's the question that's being asked. I'm not sure anyone has done that study.
No, but I would like to answer that question. I would like to reframe that question so I could give you a good answer. So I would put it this way. If the larger environment is contributing to the problem, how do we blunt that contribution? So if some people would say that now the political climate and our leadership is contributing to the problem, whether or not we agree, we could say if the media and the larger environment is contributing to the problem. So the answer is the following. And it's interesting because in the introduction, we were all asked to talk to someone behind us and form a relationship with someone in the room. In the absence of meaningful, close relationships, media has a much stronger effect. But in the presence of meaningful, close relationships, we blunt the effect of the media. So, if I believe in the misperception that most of you wouldn't respect me if I intervened, and the media only tells me stories of people who intervened and got in trouble, then I'm not going to intervene. Because we only hear in the media, like in Oregon, some people got killed this year when they tried to intervene in the subway. But maybe there were 10,000 successful interventions in Portland last year that we never heard about. So if I'm part of a community that I care about, then that dilutes the effect of the bigger culture.
So that's the effect of reporting the anomalous event, which of course we do all the time because we don't report the 5,000 planes that landed safely at the airport.
Right, or the school board president doesn't know about all the kids in the high school who don't drink and don't go to alcohol parties. So
that's the distorted lens that we get sometimes in this kind of media coverage.
So let's say in a larger culture which has many toxic elements, we still want to address that because we're citizens of the society, but University of Minnesota doesn't have to wait for the society to change in order to blunt the negative effects of the society.
Risk reduction as a general strategy seems to be strongly connected to victim blaming. How do we combat that?
If risk reduction is connected to or reinforces victim blaming, then it's irresponsible, ineffective risk reduction. That's the bluntest way I could say it. So let me give you an example. So Chris Gittich, who's one of the experts on risk reduction, when she studies this, she finds that the women who took a risk reduction workshop who are still assaulted afterwards are less likely to blame themselves and have a healthier recovery. So that's a healthy risk reduction workshop. Because the workshop teaches you not to blame yourself for what happened to you when maybe the environment is blaming you. So if risk reduction in any way, shape, or form reinforces victim blaming, then it's unethical, ineffective risk reduction.
So words are important here.
Yes. Like one of the other researchers calls it rape avoidance. So we never should consider that prevention. Like I get a lot of emails, so I got an email from a colleague that said, at our university, we're using this person's risk reduction program, and we want to also do something for men, so we're contacting you. And I said, you better do something for men right away, because if you're doing risk reduction and not doing rape prevention, then you're creating a victim blaming frame of mind. So it's very subtle.
The question, does internet sex and pornography play a role in what we see going on in college campuses? Is there any sense of that in the research at this point?
Well, there's a lot of really good scientific research on pornography.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like I said about the alcohol. The pornography doesn't cause a behavior, but it facilitates a behavior. So pornography isn't good because it encourages things that magnify or intensify the problem. But if we wouldn't want to think that if we eliminated pornography, we would solve the problem, but we would still be good to eliminate pornography. And I thought that example I gave you where we didn't talk about pornography and pornography use went down was good because the people that were consuming it really didn't want to be consuming it.
This is a system question, and it has to do with those individuals, students, I think, who have been sanctioned through a disciplinary decision. And the question is, what office should be responsible for offering class or program for individuals, almost 100% male, who've been sanctioned through a disciplinary decision, if and when they are on probation or suspended and then want to return? Should there be a single office in a university structure for something like that?
That's up to you all.
Okay.
In other words, we also have to have compassion for the perpetrator because like most perpetrators might have suffered child abuse. In other words, human beings aren't born as perpetrators, right? There's all these studies of children that children don't have racial prejudices, you know, all these things. We come here innocent. So someone who learns to be a perpetrator has also been hurt and needs help, but they still need to be accountable for their behavior. And someone who is accused or convicted of a crime that could jeopardize their career, we also need to have sympathy for that person, and we also need to monitor that person. So we do need to have structures in place that will do that, but I don't think it's appropriate for me to recommend how you do that. You know, that's where experts get carried away with their expertise and they recommend things that they don't know better, because it depends on the culture, the structure, and the environment of this campus, how you do that. So that would be my answer. You need to do it, but it's not for me to tell you how to do it.
So we have one last question. I think this is really simple question and will require a one-word answer from you. Helpful presentation. Can we get your slides?
The answer is you can have the PD.
One word.
Sorry, I have a PhD. I can't help myself.
Okay.
I do not usually like to give out the actual PowerPoint, but I'm happy to have the institution give you a PDF of the slides. So the answer, depending on how you interpret that, the answer is either yes or no.
Total certainty, I'm sure. Ladies and gentlemen, would you join me in thanking Alan Berkowitz? And I want to thank all of you for being here for this session. Some of you will be joining us for a session in about 15 minutes. We'll be taking a brief break. And let me ask this. How many of you are right now on one of the work groups or the coordinating committee for this President's Initiative? I'd like to see a show of hands. Okay, very good, very good. Yes, they deserve applause too. Well, again, thank you very much. Alan, I think, has really helped us to understand the key factors that are involved in this. And I hope those of you that are working on those work groups that this will help to clarify some directions for you, because we have till October 2nd to get the President a report, and he is expecting it. So thank you very much, all of you, for coming.